This meeting of the Kenmore Planning Commission. The first item on the agenda is citizen comment. Any citizen wishing to render comment should approach the podium on our left and your right, state your name, your address, and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Do we have a sign-in sheet? Thank you. All right, if I mispronounce your name, please correct me when you come step forward. The first name on the list is Patrick Lowe. Patrick? Hello? It's all right. You're not the first. The next name is John Crumwhitey.
Thank you. I'm John Crumwhite. I live at Inglewood East Mobile Home Park, right over here on the river. Yep. And speaking for our group, we're forming a homeowner association there, and we'd like an extension on the moratorium. There's so many factors involved with the issue right now, and so many different options. And I think that it deserves some more time to be resolved properly so that it's fair to everybody. We've got a lot of issues. I was driving here tonight, and there's a big puddle on the road again, and our water's leaking again. And our boat access is fenced off with a big chain and lock on it. You have to pay $50 now to open the lock to get to the boat launch is the reason that I bought in there. We've got a lot of issues, and we'd like to get them addressed, and we'd like to, be treated fairly. We've paid millions of dollars of rent in the last few years, and with those millions of dollars in rent, I think we deserve to be treated better than to just be blown off. I think we deserve a little time for consideration to get this done right. That's about all I got to say right now. But I just like to get some more time.
Yeah. Thank you, John. The next name on the list is Robert Spurlock.
Have this gentleman speak a little bit louder. It's really hard to understand him when he's up there.
Okay, I'll ask.
I'll try and speak louder. Is that okay now?
Okay, well, yeah, that's better. I'm just trying to help you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the help.
Welcome back, Robert.
Yeah, my name is Walter Spurlock. I live in Jim's Mobile Home Park right down the street here. And me and my wife been there 31 years. And questions that we have in both our minds is our mobile home is 1974 model mobile home year, that is. And I've been told it's too old to move to another location, so it puts us in a real dilemma what to do with our place. We're essentially losing our house when we do have to move. So the question is that quite possibly you'd probably entertain those thoughts of what's going to happen to the people who are displaced because of this action going on around Kenmore. Like I said before, I'm not against progress, but be aware of the people who are so affected by your steps to maintain progress, and it'll be quite a financial loss for us just to have to leave the home there. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. The last name on the list is Dale Marr. Or it might be Dave Marr, so feel free to correct me, Dave.
I signed in. Really didn't have anything to say, and particular, I'm here to observe the meeting. I'm also with Englewood East, and I want to just observe the meeting and see what is being said and done about the issues down there. We have a bunch of people who are trying to get organized and see what we can do to make it work for all of us down there. See what the plans are for the city. Hopefully they're not different than our plans. So I'm just here to observe. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it Dave or Dale?
Pardon me?
Your name, is it Dave?
David.
Is it Dave? Got it.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, that exhausts the names on the list, but anybody else who wants to step forward and speak is welcome to do so.
Hi, my name is Christine Suzuki, and I live with my significant other in Lakewood Villa. And both of us not only live in Kenmore, but we have businesses in Kenmore. I want to really try to stress that we need to save these communities, not displace them. They're very important communities, and of all the people, of all the residents in Kenmore that we have to maybe inconvenience by densifying, providing, opportunities for other people to move in. These communities are the most vulnerable. We're talking about people who are either low income or they're fixed income or they're elderly and maybe low income and fixed income. They've spent their life savings. Most of them have spent their life savings to buy these homes. And then they buy the homes, and you also then pay rent, for the land, to be there. But if you leave these homes, they cannot move the homes somewhere. And if you force them to leave the homes, we're basically forfeiting their life savings. They don't have any more money to go out and buy another home. And, again, of all the people in Kenmore, these are the most vulnerable communities. And in some cases, they will literally be homeless. I mean, they don't have a plan B, They don't have the nest egg. They spent the nest egg to buy the home. And so I just want to plead with you that I know there's lots of ways to densify the city. There's, you can rezone things. You can rezone the residential areas to allow backyard cottages and mother-in-laws, It may not be popular with some of those residents to have that kind of thing going on in their community, but we're residents too, And it's not, it's disproportionately unfair that these communities have to pay the price for everyone to gain density. So, and that's pretty much what I want to say, and I want to submit a letter that I wrote, and also I'm submitting a copy of an article I just saw where in Denver, for their homeless communities, they're building little homes and putting them in little parks. So basically, they're building manufactured home parks to support their low-income people. So, thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I do want to point out that the Planning Commission has proposed rezones to the City Council and other parts of the city. And the City Council has adopted a lot of those. There are other areas that have been rezoned for more density. So this isn't exclusive, and in fact, the existing zoning is what we're talking about that would allow for more density. The question is, how do we balance the interests of the residents, which are very important, with other interests of other people who are looking for more housing, interests of the owners of the properties who invested in this, with the expectation that they may have choices down the road. But your comments are well taken. Thank you. All right, I think that concludes the citizen comment portion of tonight's meeting. Next item on the agenda is Housing Strategy Plan, Preserving Existing Affordable Housing. I invite the city staff and their consultants to the presentation table.
Good evening, Planning Commission. I believe there are several handouts in front of you with background information provided in response to questions that you asked at your last meeting. So tonight, I think the plan was not to spend too much time on that background information, but to go through sort of the schedule and look at some of the scenarios and start moving towards your recommendation. So on that, I'm going to turn this over to Laurie, and she has a couple of slides to go through. And the first one is to talk about the schedule.
Good evening. So I wanted to briefly go over this tentative schedule to give you and to those who are listening a general idea of the potential progress of this project, knowing, as we discussed at your last meeting, that the next thing on the agenda is the update of the critical areas rules and the Shoreline Master Program. So this chart shows the meeting dates. Over in the left column, it shows who's holding the meeting. And then the true projects that are on your docket for this year are shown in the columns. The critical areas and Shoreline Master Program update, that's the SMP update. And then in the right-hand column, the Housing Strategy Plan, Preserving Existing Affordable Housing. So tonight, March 20, we anticipate continuing the discussion. Your two meetings in April, we're thinking would be the time when you would make your preliminary recommendations. Getting ready for a public hearing tentatively scheduled for May 1st. There's a city council meeting in there April 23rd. That would be the meeting where the city council would consider an extension of a moratorium, and they have to hold a public hearing associated with that. So that's scheduled for April 23rd. After your public hearing on May 1st, we anticipate that you would make your final recommendations for a June 11 date for the joint meeting with the City Council where you would present your recommendations. We have talked before about how this project is a little bit different from others in that we're not taking forward code amendments. Instead, it's a series of approaches, a single approach, whatever your recommendation is for approaches to the mobile home parks, and then in discussion, the City Council will provide direction if code amendments are needed, and then we can work directly with them on the code amendments. So that is the tentative schedule, and then on June the 5th, the night when you discuss, typically you discuss your City Council presentation before you hold your joint meeting, but that's not a long agenda item, and so we would actually introduce the Critical Areas and Shoreline Master Program Update Project to you. The City Council authorized the contract with the consultant, which Shannon and Wilson is going to be our consultant to help us go through this project and to provide the scientific expertise that we need for this project. And so we anticipate having the city manager sign the contract hopefully this week. All right, so any questions on the tentative schedule?
Questions? None?
Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was that wealth of paperwork in front of you, and I'm just going to tell you what those are. I think there's only one piece out of the background information that we might review this evening, and then the last two pages are really the focus of tonight's discussion. But I apologize for providing it in hard copy to you. We certainly can attach it to your next packet, but we had 3 days. So we were trying to get as much information as we could. So some of the information that was provided there, you had asked for a list of projects within the last 10 years that included more than 20 units. So that is one piece of information. You had asked about development of mobile home parks and whether an overlay impacted development of mobile home parks. We contacted Craig Hillis, who you recall came to speak with you. To his knowledge, there have been no new mobile home parks developed in the Puget Sound area in the past 10 years. So the overlay is kind of a moot point. Communities that don't have them and communities that do have them are not seeing new mobile home development. Then there was the utility information from North Shore Utility District, comparing the mobile home park rates with single-family homeowner rates. We do not have the pad cost information, sort of the demographic information about how much the rents are. We have some anecdotal information from folks who spoke at the meetings, and it seemed to be around $600 to $650, but there was a fairly wide variation. And that information, it's kind of a privacy issue. Folks may not be willing to give us that information if we ask for it. So we're still talking about that particular issue. And then the last piece, I tried to put these in order as I'm talking about them. The last piece is a set of photographs, and those I do want to call up. So Mike did a fantastic job collecting these photos of different projects in the area and then what their densities look like. So I'm just briefly going to run down these so you can get a sense of these different projects. And Mike, please jump in if I'm saying something incorrectly. The first project is in Redmond. This, I think, is probably a rendering. Is this a rendering? This is a real one? Okay. Anyway, this is at a density of 148 dwelling units per acre. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories at 148 dwelling units per acre. Okay. The next photograph is of two projects. The one on the left is called Junction. The one on the right is called Six Oaks. These are both in Bothell. And you can see the one on the left is 83 dwelling units per acre. The one on the right is 106 dwelling units per acre. And I have a couple of other photos that actually give you a better sense of the buildings themselves. This is a photograph of the Junction under construction. This, again, is the project that was at 83 dwelling units per acre. The Six Oaks project, here's a better image of that, at 106 dwelling units per acre. Okay, continuing on, this one is called the 104, also in Bothell, 86 dwelling units per acre. And you had asked about projects on smaller sites. So this one is a 1.3 acres. I could go back and we could look at the acreage, but there are definitely some smaller parcels included in here. Mile House in Redmond, this is 1.2 acres, 152 units to the acre. And then our own Link and Spencer 68, 52 and 80 units to the acre. So I don't know if you have any questions about those, but that gives you a sense of how projects, even though they're not very tall, may still be able to provide a great deal of density.
Question.
Mike? Yes.
I was curious, do you have a sense of what the square footage is or number of bedrooms in these facilities, or is it a consistent development standard here, or who are they targeting? I assume these are all rental units, so.
They're all rental properties. I can't say that they are consistent in the mix of units. Experience in the last 5, 6 years has been that they tend to be more bedroom side.
Other questions? Oh, opposite. I had a question. So, who? Thank you. The number of multifamily rental properties built in the last 10 years in Kenmore. There's Spencer 68, of course. Link, I think, was developed by the same developer. Is that right?
Correct.
Main Street?
Right.
So they were developed at the same time.
Right. They're right next to
essentially.
each other. Mm-hmm.
So they were both projects where the underlying zoning required a certain set aside for. No, it looks like Link did not.
Right. Correct. Only
Okay.
the Spencer 68 project did.
That was part of was that part of the same negotiation? The developer negotiating with the city for all the land for both projects?
There were different requirements for affordability on
Right.
each parcel. So there was a requirement to provide a certain number of affordable units on the old Park and Ride property, which was the Spencer 68 site.
I guess there's no way to know if, is it Main Street Development Company, the one that developed the properties? Is there a way to know if they would have developed Link if not for, or developed Spencer 68 with its affordable units if not for the ability to develop Link? If there was some connection between the two, they were negotiated as.
I don't recall that.
I guess what I'm getting at is, what I'm seeing here is 3 of the 4 multifamily projects have a relationship to either the city as the seller and the city making price concessions to induce the developer to build affordable units, or in the case of Copper Lantern, it was a nonprofit. So their goal was to provide, I assume, was to provide more affordable units. I mean, all their units are affordable units, which would leave one purely private sector development 8 years ago, North Shore Townhomes. So that's, part of my concern is, what do we need to do as a city to try and attract multifamily investment and increase housing supply so there's more choices for people seeking housing? And it's been 8 years, I think, since we've had that happen organically. So that's one reason I was thinking, gee, maybe we can get some input from the development community and say, what are you looking for? What would it take to get you to invest in housing that provides affordable units with market units, that kind of thing? But that's just an observation. Anything else? Okay. Lori?
Right. Okay, so now we are ready to turn our attention back to the March 15th packet. Last time we had a good discussion about the background information, but the next thing we were going to look at was the scenarios. So I want to call those up, and there's a handout. Maybe I'm going to call it up. We shall see. There we go. Why will it not open? Any ideas, Bridget? Huh? It will call it up and then it closes it. That is really weird. Well, maybe we're not going to put it. Okay. I'm going to chat while Arthur plays around with it. And I apologize for the audience. I don't know why it will not call it up. But it's the critical thing is the sheet that looks like this. It's got yellow highlighting on the front. It doesn't, no, I think it's, oh, yes, that is the one I want. Okay, Arthur did it, yay. Okay, so the first 3 scenarios are the exact scenarios that you have discussed previously and that were the topic at your meeting with the property owners and your meeting with the residents. So the areas highlighted in yellow are some suggestions after listening to all of this public input and doing our background research that we would like to recommend that you consider for these scenarios. So the first scenario, as you recall, is the one that would control redevelopment by restricting the zoning on the mobile home parks and then allowing the park owners to do a transfer of development rights to another property. And then the third part of that, with the condition that the mobile home park then be preserved. And then the third part of that was an interest in a regional TDR program. So last time we talked about an alternative to TDR that I think some of you had expressed interest in, and that was a fee in lieu instead of a TDR. And a fee in lieu is, for the audience, is when a developer, rather than build affordable units, they pay the value of those affordable units to another entity. In this particular scenario, what would happen would be that a person in an area where you can get increased density, you can build more units. If you include affordable units, and there are a number of places like that, the TOD, almost every multifamily zone has the opportunity to increase density through the residential density incentives program. The new areas that you rezoned in the neighborhood business zone has that opportunity. Anyway, in these circumstances, rather than build those units, the project proponent could pay a fee in lieu to essentially buy their affordable units in a preserved mobile home park. So do you understand the concept there? It's more traditionally associated with affordable housing activities than the TDR, which, as you know, we could use for affordable housing, but which more traditionally has been used for open space. The development community appears to really like fee in lieu because they don't have to build the affordable units. They pay an amount, and then their project can get the increased density, but they're all market rate units. So staff is recommending that you could include or replace TDR with this type of a fee in lieu program.
Questions?
So
Carol?
just to clarify, the fees that a developer would pay would go to preserve the mobile home parks.
Correct.
Can you describe how those monies actually would do that?
Right. So I think probably the most common approach would be that they would pay the fee to the city, and then the city would be basically the banker that would transfer the money to the mobile home park owner.
With the stipulation that
the park be preserved.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, that helps.
Right. And I think in some of the parks, the question would be, well, how would you accumulate the amount of money needed? But several of the property owners are not anticipating a near-term sale, so there might be time to accomplish something like that.
Anybody else? Yes, Dennis.
The language that you used in that pay a fee in lieu to the MHP property owner, that seems a little imprecise compared to what you just described. So as we go forward, it ought to be clear that pay a fee in lieu to the city to broker.
The deal.
Yeah. If you don't have it in there, it looks like they have to do several negotiations.
Right.
Anybody else? Dennis?
Well, no, I just wasn't sure I was clear to Lori about amending that language. It is? Okay.
Scott?
And you figure out the value with the zoning that they have currently and have that appraised, and that's how you set the amount of money the preserving park gets. Is that how it works?
I'm going to let Arthur answer that.
After a after accounting, yes, that's one of the steps. The other step is it's not the money, the land has value under existing uses. So you're trying to deal somehow with a delta between what the value is in the preservation scenario versus the value in a redevelopment scenario. So you would be comparing those to make some calculation. So you need to look at both parts of that equation.
And do you think there's enough money for the ones that, the property that gets the density to be able to fund that number?
So that's where the charts that we gave you sort of gave estimates, and I would call them at best estimates. They're ballpark estimates at this point. And just knowing what, the numbers we picked for the in lieu values are not inconsistent with what we're seeing used in other communities right now. So we don't. So we think that given all the different areas in your community, you basically have 3 or 4 areas in the city where you have these incentives where where the densities are below much lower than what you're seeing in the pictures we just showed you, where there would be potential interest for that. And so we did some in the table from last, I don't know which table number it was, but the table that we put in the back last meeting shows you some ballpark estimates. And that does seem to be well within your potential capacity.
Vice Chair?
Would the requirement for preservation kick in with the very first payment? In other words, if the property owner got the first payment, does that trigger the preservation, in perpetuity? How does that work? So if they get one payment, they're obligated until whatever the terms of the arrangement, right?
Correct.
There's no
that's
threshold.
Whether or not there's some flexibility in negotiating, but in general, that would be the concept, yes. The most parallel scenario I can think of is an existing affordable complex in Bellevue, privately owned, where the private owner agreed to maintain the affordability in exchange for a very low interest rate loan. Actually, he agreed to do it for a low interest loan and some other cash they received, some public funding. And so he agreed to a long-term affordability for that one upfront payment. It's a little more complex than that, but that's the basic concept.
Anybody else? Yeah, please.
I'm curious, has anyone ever looked at, instead of the dollars going directly to the owners, that it be used as part of a leveraged buyout that will allow the homeowners to purchase the property?
That very much might be an alternative, where a landowner might say, fine, if I can get a land value under the existing use and you give me some funds in addition, that is definitely a potential scenario. But you lay them out pretty much the same way. One is they stay on as owner and agree. The other is they actually, and in fact, for most of the assisted housing we've done, we've said we'd work with the existing owners. Most of the time the owner says, why don't I just sell it to the person who's going to take care of it long term, as long as I get enough money between the sale of the property plus the public assistance that you're bringing to the table.
I'm not following this.
Okay, so let me try to re-explain. So basically, you find a way to cash out the current owner for the existing the value of his redevelopment potential of the property.
Right.
And that comes from a combination of what the buying entity, the homeowners and or the nonprofit, can afford. They can get in debt because there is still cash flow, plus the funds from the in lieu fees to make up the difference, like in the chart we showed you last.
So what would the zoning say? If you were to rezone this to accommodate this kind of a plan,
right?
Would it still allow the current owner to, if they wanted to, sell it for its current market value?
The current market value is going to be based on it being preserved as manufactured housing. But they're going to get compensation.
Right now, that's a change in the zoning. Right now, the market value is its development potential, isn't it?
Right. And so this scenario, that's the same model in the original scenario one, that the down zone happens, but then there's a compensation program associated with it. So this notion of replacing the TDR approach with a fee in lieu approach is just, it's like a variation of scenario one.
Right, and I think there's a lot of appeal to that because, as you said, there's a lot more interest in doing a fee in lieu, and so it's more realistic.
Right.
But I'm kind of wondering how the mechanics work out here. If you do a down zone, then I guess the owner only really gets the current market value after a period of time in which new development has paid the fee in lieu that accrues up to the level of the gap between the down zone value and the current zone value, right?
Yeah, that could be the case, right?
Doesn't it rely on a lot of assumptions that this money's going to be accrue in a reasonable period of time, and actually, if ever?
Well, I think you'd have to look at the individual parks. We could go back to that chart that showed the equivalent of how many units. It does rely on other places redeveloping to higher density.
Yeah.
But that was also the case with the TDR program.
Yeah, right.
So I'm not sure it's really different
I don't think it's
in
any
that
worse,
regard.
but we had a lot of concerns about the feasibility and the likelihood of a TDR development being sufficient to compensate current owners for what they invested in. So isn't that one of the big concerns about even with a fee in lieu?
I think it would be the same issue, potentially. Yeah, right.
I think the challenge in this would be, you could, through the in lieu fees, generate some dollars that could be used to leverage additional financing, but you wouldn't be able to cover through the in lieu fee the entire market value of the property. So there would have to be a secondary financing in there that would be either serviced through payments by the owners who now have ownership of the property. Perhaps there's some sort of low-interest loan that's used to underwrite that gap that would then be paid back through owner fees over time. But it's a pretty complicated calculation to figure out. It may not fit each one of the home parks. A lot would depend upon what is the value of the underlying land as it stands versus how much could actually be netted out of a fee in lieu proposal. And then, of course, then you have to figure out the secondary financing. But it is a way to be able to preserve the home parks and get the ownership back, the total ownership back to the current residents without relying on some of the other mechanisms we talked about.
Right.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, the chart, the analysis of preservation of existing parks, the chart we went over last time, indicated that the comparable number of fee in lieu units would range from 9 to 44 at the highest, depending on the park. So that's something that you could consider.
Well, this fee in lieu as a financing device is what still confuses me. They're talking about, I think, transferring the fee in lieu ultimately to the owner. You're talking about using fee in lieu money as what? Down payment on a
yes,
mortgage?
use the fee in lieu money as the equity in a buyout of the property. So the dollars would eventually go to the current owner the same way as it would, but it would go in the form of a buyout rather than a replacement for an agreement to not develop.
It's kind of a combination of scenarios 1 and 3. Scenario 3 is kind of the purchase option. So what you're suggesting is that taking a fee in lieu could be used in a scenario where purchase was the ultimate goal.
That's right. I mean, in my thinking, the weakness to scenario 3 is how do you come up with that dollar leverage to finance it? And what I'm suggesting is the fee in lieu could be the equity to finance a scenario like number 3. Or at least that's my question. That's why I started with, has this ever been done before?
So I'm going to refer you, because in an ideal world, I'd have an example to put up on a couple different examples, because you're sort of we're talking simultaneously about two different scenarios. One is an owner keeping the property and agreeing to downzone it and stuff, and somehow restrict the use. The other is someone purchasing who's going to do that because that's what they want to do, either the residents or a nonprofit who wants to preserve it in its current use. But on one level, the economics is the same, and that's why I want to point you back to that table. And because the numbers still are essentially the same. This is the analysis preservation of existing parks. And what we're basically saying is if you look at that, there was a column F that said value with existing use. So that's something that says, and then column E is what is the land value in a redevelopment scenario. So that's what you're trying to figure out a way to get an owner that value of. And we're saying you get it from a combination. If you're trying to preserve the park, you get it from a combination of two things. One, we're not making your land zero when you agree to keep it as manufactured housing, and we're estimating what that value is in column F. That then use the gap, which was column G, which has to be compensated. In either case, that value needs to get to the existing landowner, either through a sale in which a third party is cobbling together enough money to offer that price, which comes from what they could probably borrow based on column F, and other sources. And that other sources, we're saying if you wanted to use only in lieu fees, this is probably about how many you would need to collect to raise enough money to make up that difference. Whether or not you might be able to leverage some of the, especially if it were a transfer scenario where the owner said, okay, I'm getting my value for my land and I don't care how I get it, then there is a better chance that residents or a nonprofit or the housing authority would be able to secure a couple of different public sources to help with that gap. But in both scenarios, you're trying to get the owner to a land value based on current zoning.
Yeah. And I think the goals are laudable.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder about the likelihood. We haven't seen it done before. I don't know of nonprofits that are out there looking to buy. It'd be great if they were.
There specifically are.
So that's great, but then we got this list that says there are no new mobile home parks that have opened in the Puget Sound area in the last 10 years.
But that's not the economics we're even dealing with here. We're dealing with the economics of what a landowner might say, the investment part you said he made based on a zoning decision. So you're right, we're not trying to build a new park here. We're trying to preserve. And I guess the comment I would make about show me exactly where this has been done before. I've been doing this for 40 years. I don't do any two deals the same. I worked for a company that every deal we structured based on the nuance of that piece of land. Right. I think what we've tried to show you is in other jurisdictions around here, builders offered an in lieu alternative are more like to have that conversation. So that's a way to potentially find how to address some of that gap, and maybe all of it. Okay?
And I think we agree on that.
Right. So
I'm just talking about likelihoods. We've got data, we've got history in Kenmore. This isn't happening.
Right. So that's
the affordable exploiting the density incentives is not happening.
And so that
it may. Right, I get that it's maybe, but there's a lot of maybes around this. And you're putting the weight of all the maybes on the people who've provided this housing for a long time.
So now I want to push it back to Lori, because part of what you're talking about here is how do you use zoning to make the maybes more likely?
Right. And
different scenarios to help make it more likely. The different scenarios that you want potentially to be out there. And is that one of the pieces to helping get there in a fair way? So
I think there are definitely permutations of this approach. One would be that assuming that a mobile home park were on the same cycle of redevelopment, I'm not sure that we would then assume that other parcels would not. So if there's redevelopment going on, you would assume that it would be in a number of different places, which would then offer the opportunity to get the fee in lieu. That's just a thought. For example, if you had a mobile home park property and you were wanting to redevelop it, would you not be doing that at the same time as other redevelopment was occurring in the community? That may be why we haven't seen the mobile home parks redevelop, for the same reason we haven't seen other parcels redevelop. It's kind of the same idea, that maybe it will all happen at the same time, or close to. The other thought I had is that not only could the city serve as a bank, but the city could potentially serve as the bridge. So, for example, if the preservation were to happen with the first taking of fee in lieu, maybe the city helps fund that, and then as additional fees in lieu come in, they pay themselves back.
So the city writes a check to the MHP
Potentially.
owners
I mean, that's a direct assistance
sooner than
thing.
later, so they don't have to wait many, many years.
Correct.
Until it accrues, the fee and lieu's accrue.
Right.
These are some, and I think that's an idea worth working on. But these are some big checks the city would have to write, right? Millions
For
of dollars
some, yeah.
up front.
For some of them.
And the city's annual revenues are what? Tax revenues?
I don't know.
A council discussion, but that's part of, is that Arch cities help it, to help with something like this? And it's done as a loan. The project I gave you up front, while it was only one city, it could have been worked that way. And like I said, it was a loan, and then the cities got reimbursed over time. So there may be different ways of structuring using the partnership role as well as, and those are all things that we're trying to get ready to start thinking harder about.
And I think this may be something we propose to the city, but I'd like to the council. But I'd like to let them know, we have concerns too, and this is something that would need a lot of work. I remember I was watching a video on the city's website of one of their meetings in January. And I think it was, the mobile home park issue came up, and they were looking at our scenarios at the time. I don't know if everybody saw this. Might have been the second meeting in January. It was one where the new council members were sworn in. And Councilmember Curtis looked at one of our scenarios, the redevelopment one, where there's a lot of affordable set-asides. I mean, it was very conceptual then, of course. And he said, I don't know how that's even going to work. Why would they even propose that to us? Because I think he was thinking about the lack of investment already and the cost to the developers, and whether it would be a sufficient profit to induce developers to do that. So that led me to think, we don't want to give them something half-baked, or they're not going to take it seriously. So that's one reason I'm playing devil's advocate with this. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead, Scott.
So,
first,
I mean, well taken, but can you take stock of what developable land there is in the city that you can, figure out if it's feasible? If you're going to generate, we've got, 30 acres of land that we can put high-density buildings on, and no problem, we got it covered. But if it's not feasible, if the numbers don't work, so I would think you'd have to somehow take stock of the higher density areas and see how much you're going to, how much money you're going to create to pay it off, and if it's feasible, then the city council would probably go, okay, that's what I'd like to see.
And
we did a rough analysis of that.
I'm sorry?
We did a rough analysis of that, and it seemed, and we were looking at it in terms of the straight TDR option. Was there enough capacity in the city, and we were looking at downtown commercial and downtown residential, and making some estimates about where there were opportunities for increased development. And we, I think, concluded that there were many hundreds of available units, many hundreds. And what we were looking for at the time was 256 to replace every mobile home park. So, or to transfer, every mobile home, to transfer every mobile home unit.
Right.
So, I don't think there's a capacity issue. I mean, we've looked at the rough numbers. We have the general numbers from the comprehensive plan. We have enough opportunity in the city to do this.
If there was sufficient investment incentive, that's
But-
the big question mark. I'm going to let Mike talk in a second, but I want to let you finish first.
But that's always the case. I mean, we often put rules in place,
Yeah.
planning for the future, not knowing if, in fact, it's ever going to occur. We don't know that the mobile home parks will ever really want to redevelop. We don't know that the TOD will develop. We don't know that, but we put the tools in place, assuming that it will at some point turn.
Mike's been anxious to.
Well, I just wanted to add in, once again, it's a big part of my problem with this whole discussion is just what is the deliverable that we're being asked to present to the city council. I think it's very different from what we're used to, and I personally keep stumbling over trying to make a proposal or a recommendation, but that's not what we've been asked for. I think realistically, and I agree with you, Doug, I mean, what we're looking at is very difficult. We don't have the resources or the knowledge in this group to make these decisions or to get too far on this. But what I think we can do is we can put together a relatively short list of, okay, doing some due diligence and some thought to it, here are some options the city council could consider. And that's about all we can do. And I think our scenarios are getting pretty close to it. Maybe we want to add some note to this about what we see the limitations are, just as we've discussed. You know, what makes this, what are our concerns about this being realistic, this scenario versus another scenario? But I think that's as far as we can go.
Well, I think with the time, kind of the schedule the staff gave out, I think you're right. I don't think we have time to get enough information. I mean, I've been saying for a while, gee, why don't we hear from the development community? We're really hanging our hat on their willingness to come in and build things to pay fees in lieu to give the city the money to make this preservation effort work. But nobody's asked them.
That's right. Well,
and I'm like, gee, there's a big hole in our our information, and nobody's filling it.
That's right. There's a lot of issues, including the ones that Scott brought up. If the city council wants to throw this back to us and say, okay, we like your scenarios, give us an analysis and a recommendation based upon some serious study and consideration, yeah, we can do that. But we don't have the time or the resources to do that.
Not under this schedule.
Not under this schedule, and not with the resources we've been given. We need financial analysis out of this. We need developer input. We need a lot of resources that aren't available to us to be able to do a recommendation or even form a proposal.
They're not available to us now. I think it's plausible that it could happen, but again, maybe that's for the city council to decide.
Exactly, and I think that's the deliverable that we've been faced with, is we can present to the city council some scenarios for further development, which they can decide to either do on their own or they can throw back to us. But in terms of actually making a recommendation or even doing any kind of feasibility
it's going to be
we're not there.
Right. It's going to be a list of suggestions with a lot of caveats.
That's right. And I think that's fair. That's what we've been asked to do.
I think that's fine. I think that is what you've been asked to do. And and so the notion of these sort of generalized scenarios that would need lots of very specific attention, you're right, we're not going to get there in the time frame that we have. But we could, or the Planning Commission could say, generally, we are interested in this direction for this park, these parks, 1 park, 5 parks, if these things.
There'll be a lot of ifs.
Yeah, and that's fine.
Yeah, and I think we get it. I think we're all kind of coming to that position here.
Right.
But my concern was the reaction that Councilmember Curtis had at that meeting, and that wasn't very much. That wasn't an endorsement. And maybe it's something we ask them before we wrap this up. Maybe we go back and say, hey, here's where we're at, and here's where we're likely to be. Do you want us to keep doing this now, or do you want us to give you what we have?
And here's the list of resources we'd have to make available to
do. And at least they know we're sensitive to that. We're not trying to shirk anything here, but these are the limits of what we can do at this point. Carol's been very patient over here, so I apologize for being late. But
those are all very valid comments to make, and I think it's best to be intentional about what the vision that the City Council has. Their vision is to preserve this affordable housing, and so we've done some due diligence and figured out that we don't have enough information, like you said. I think with that, we could still come up with some plausible types of scenarios that would have those, kind of escape clauses, like if this doesn't happen, then you can't do this. But if this happens, you might have, 3 options in front of you as you negotiate forward. Those would be very helpful for the council to have, and I think probably Councilmember Curtis was looking at the general idea of, whatever, without knowing any of the details, none of the feedback from the public or the other things that we gathered. Having said that, working on these intentional scenarios would also set us up to be able to also recommend that they extend the moratorium so then they can either, if they want to kick it back to us to work on it, maybe later in the summer or the fall, or, I think it'll at least give them a pretty good idea that we're not going to hand them an idea that they're going to run with. I think out of courtesy to the residents and the landowners, extending the moratorium makes sense. So,
Well, I think the schedule the staff gave us almost assumes it.
It does.
The city council can't make it. They've got the city council deliberating after the moratorium expires.
Exactly.
They would have to extend it even to make sense of what we give them,
Yeah.
let alone giving us more time if they want us to take more time.
So would it be legitimate for us as we move forward with these scenarios and we move to that April 23rd date to along the way also come up with a recommendation of perhaps how long of a moratorium we'd like to recommend? Obviously, it's their decision, and it's got to fit the other things on their schedule, but I think time is necessary.
Typically, a moratorium extension is 6 months.
Okay.
And then if we extend it 6 months, then we'll be at a year.
Okay.
So I think the intention was that, extending it for 6 months, I think there's justification to do that, to show that we are making progress, but we're not there yet. So I don't think there'll be any question that it's necessary to extend the moratorium. I'm pretty sure that will happen. So I think 6 months, then you would then see where you are in 6 months. But the assumption on the moratorium is that you are making progress on the underlying reason why you put the moratorium in effect.
But I think, soliciting interest from developers, especially if we had something to work with.
Yeah. I think it's very likely that this will not come back to the Planning Commission. I think it's very likely that it will stay with the City Council.
Okay.
With your recommendations in front of them. And part of the reason for that is that we have a deadline for the critical areas and shoreline. June 30th in 2019, it has to be done and into the state and approved. So we really need to devote the Planning Commission time to that. Now, that said, the City Council could say, well, this piece of it, we want to go back to the Planning Commission, and then we just have to figure out how to fit it in.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Vice Chair?
Scott.
I don't know who was first, but
Oh.
I had called Mark.
You
and then I'll go to you.
Scott,
go ahead.
Let Mark go.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I agree with the directions we're looking at here. I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess I did have a specific question about the fee in lieu, and that is, to what extent does that address the issue of the infrastructure and sort of encouraging or fostering or helping the property owners address the infrastructure? We've heard that's a potentially significant issue and potentially very expensive. Does this compensation, in your view, address that potential issue?
I would say no, but what I'd really like to do is to keep going through the scenarios, because I think we'll pick that notion up in another scenario that is actually not one of the top 3. Or the ones that you've previously
Fair
discussed.
enough. I think that's worth our consideration. Right?
Okay.
And thanks for bringing that up, Mark. It's something we
That's
tend to
important.
let slip, and then
And
glad
then-
you're on that.
The only, I just want, are we going to go with in lieu versus the TDR? I mean, the TDR seems like Bitcoin to me. I would think we'd recommend a fee in lieu.
Well, if that's staff is saying, we could amend this scenario to replace TDR with fee in lieu, if that's the general desire of the Planning Commission.
Anybody else? Go ahead. Dennis had his hand up first, I think.
it seems to me that what you want to do is put it in as an option. Let the developer figure out what they want to do, and they can choose the fee in lieu as an option, but they could also do the TDR if that's,
Yeah,
rather than saying this is the only alternative.
yeah. Mike?
I agree with Dennis. I was going to say the same thing. I think to the extent that we can offer flexibility through providing options and not trying to anticipate, as we have in the past, not trying to anticipate what things are going to be like 20 years from now.
Yeah.
But I think we should definitely have the fee in lieu as an option,
Yeah, I think it,
whatever scenario,
And
all the scenarios we put forward.
somebody else had a hand up here before I say something. Mike, go ahead.
The only caveat I guess I would have about the presenting alternatives of TDRs versus fees in lieu to the developers is that they both operate under the same principles. In other words, I wouldn't want to see TDRs affected by market rate versus fee in lieu, which I think we would be structuring financially as the city, right? We would be determining what those unit costs are. I think they would be predictable and known. TDRs, to me, I don't understand them maybe as well as I should, but they seem to be a little bit more market rate driven. Like, would a TDR transfer be the same in 2019 versus 2037, right? So I don't think it's bad to necessarily have them as alternatives. I would just want the playing field to be somewhat even.
Equivalent.
Yeah.
Right. I think the TDR programs that we've looked at for open space, they do have sort of an expert determine what the TDR value is and that is adjusted. That's my understanding. Is that?
But I actually think Mike very well described a little bit of a psychological difference between the two. At least how unless the city is acting as the bank like the county does, where they have to set up a purchase and sale price, there's always and most TDR programs, there's allowed to be direct transactions between the two landowners under a formula. So,
Well, Mike's point raises a question, and maybe, Mike, you covered this, but I'm thinking if we're setting fee and lieu numbers based on the current values, both development potential value versus preservation value, and the gap is the amount that we're hoping to raise through future development elsewhere. Well, I mean, this is something that happens over time. I mean, the value of the development potential will go up probably over time before the MHP owner collects the full value of the gap, right?
Maybe, unless there's another mechanism. Again, that's the notion of the city acting.
So how do you account for that?
I
think they're talking about an indexing against property values.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So you would
would the MHP, but if the MHP owner did not collect the full value of the gap in a reasonably short time after they started receiving fee and lieu payments from the city or from a developer, would they get more than the original amount because market values have changed if they went up?
I think you would be making, and I guess I would be coached by the comment on flexibility versus their single way. You would make a transaction, and whether or not it was an all-cash transaction or a payment over time transaction, the amount that you would be contracting. So in an over-time payment, all parties would have to sort of account for future value.
Right.
But there would be a set figure or payment schedule that would be agreed to, just like when you do loans on your home, right?
Yeah, that's usually interest rates, not market value.
Right, but I'm saying it's the same idea. It's like
Time
there are
value of
people
money.
who buy on installment
Right.
through negotiations, and
Okay.
that's what you would be doing in
Okay.
that scenario. And I think the question would be,
Wouldn't that-
interest might be different, so are you willing to go either way in trying to negotiate that?
And wouldn't that create some equivalency if there was, because the TDRs are property swaps, and the properties are probably going to appreciate similarly, but a fee in lieu is a fixed number, unless you
I don't
have
know if
an
it's-
escalator.
The difference
or
is
something.
that
But you're
But you're preserving something for future that has a different value. It's not just
But the development potential, which is the basis for fixing
deciding what the
the
value
gap,
is. Exactly.
that would change. Well, in this market, it's going up fast. I mean, it would, you know.
It
and
may
if
need
this-
to be indexed to something.
Right, but that's where you could get equivalents,
And
I
I think the fees in lieu would probably need to be indexed, if that's the right word, in a way too, right? Because we're selling density at that point to developers, and you know, an affordable unit may be worth something, or increased density to a developer may be worth X dollars today. It may be worth dramatically more, or potentially dramatically less in the future. And I think we need to have a way to tie that,
Right.
perhaps, to some property value data point.
I don't know if I'll be very successful here, but in a TDR world, you're exchanging like things.
Right.
Okay? But therefore, who knows what different negotiations are, and they can really fluctuate a lot. And somebody might have 50 to sell and only anybody wants 10 or 15. And so part of your dilemma is getting enough at one time. Probably your successful TDR scenario, and my guess would be someone who needs as much as available from one property, so that they're not doing multiple properties. But that's, the transaction is sort of people agreeing on that. With the in lieu, you're creating two different formulas. One is so each party is doing the formula based on what they care about. And for the in lieu, it's how much you're willing to pay to get out of having to do an affordable unit. And that's pretty straightforward math. And then for the landowner, it's how much do I need to be compensated because of the difference between the two. So right now, we might find in a site, if it says it needs 12 in lieu payments, maybe in the future it's 14, because each one of those values don't necessarily march together. But it allows each transaction to occur the way it wants to occur most naturally, in some respects. Because the in lieu, you'll just have sort of a fixed number, a relatively fixed number, and it might change in 3 years because the math for figuring out in lieu will change in 3 years.
Yeah.
And the builder who's doing that goes, I get it, I'm willing to make that transaction. The only thing so the city sort of becomes the one who deals with the inequity by saying, well, I might need one or two more extra in the future to make this deal work than I would if I'd made it this year. But
the deal's made at the time.
Right. And
a single point in time.
Right, but some of these park owners might not talk to us for 5 years. Maybe it's 5 years. Some of these might not happen for 5 years from now. That's the point I'm making. So I think that's from just being around TDRs is there's this swapping of people having different values for the same thing and having to negotiate. The seller thinks it's worth more than that, and so they have to sort of come to concurrence. Where with an in lieu, one player is making their arrangement based on their math, and another player is making theirs arrangement by their math, and then you just match, and then whatever those numbers are, you get however many you need of the in lieu to get to what the number is for that particular.
In lieu is a zoning requirement.
Right.
So to preserve the current mobile home park use. So the city's deciding how much the current owner would get to make up for their loss.
Right.
That down zone.
Correct.
So they're not the owner's not agreeing to anything. They're having to live with whatever the city decides.
But there's a more straightforward conversation and saying this is where we're coming up with our number for that. The city and the landowner can see that, be more transparent in how the math is done.
I'm probably overthinking this. Mike, go ahead.
Well, what I take away from the last half hour's discussion is that we're getting into some pretty deep waters.
Right, and I want to pull us back out of the deep water.
Well, good.
And
Let me just
say,
finish, and please do. But again, I think Mike has brought up an interesting point, which I would bring forward as a principle that we would want to include in our explanation of the scenarios that we put forward, not making a recommendation.
Right.
We're not making a proposal.
It's one of our caveats.
But it's a caveat, but also could be a principle. I mean, there's some principles we've already discussed. We want to preserve affordable housing.
Right.
We want to ensure that the current landowners receive fair market value. We can say those sorts of things. And I've encouraged us to do that and not try and anticipate or work through all the potential scenarios that could exist or the deals that could be cut among other folks that aren't in the room 20 years from now.
But it would be helpful to recognize as a caveat, we don't know exactly how this pencils out, but we recognize this issue, and we itemize those so that they know.
Yes, I
They
think
have to resolve it at some point.
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it. Is
Okay.
these as principles. These are the issues that need to be addressed before you could make any kind of final resolution.
Carol, did you want to add? And Mike?
I just think that's a great way of looking at it, because what we really want to do is build some kind of a container where the different parties can come in and actually do this kind of negotiation, so both parties benefit.
Right.
That's hard to do as a city, but we're going to listen to the other scenarios and the amendments so that we can kind of get up and get a bigger view.
Right. Mike, you had a hand.
Yeah. And I hope this isn't too far down in the weeds, but I am concerned with scenario one that we aren't competing with this preservation effort with the other affordable housing set-asides or regulations that we already have in place. Because as I look at attachment 8 from last week, from Spencer 68, that percentage of affordable units does not seem impactful enough to help us close a $12 million aggregated mobile home gap. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
There are only 5 units out of 222 at 50%, and I think the 85% is not impactful enough. I really look at the 50% number of those units and say that's really the hit, the financial hit to getting the density they wanted. And I think as long as we use those kind of numbers, even getting to a 25% total, we have to look at that approach as well if we ever want to get those fees in lieu or those TDRs rolling in. Because this is not, if I were a developer, I would look at just the cost of increasing my density via affordable units, because I don't see a huge cost to doing that here. Now, I know this isn't every deal, but in this deal, that doesn't seem like a lot of impact to the developer.
So the Spencer 68 is not what you have in place for your TDR overlay, and that's what we based our analysis on. And I would say that the ratios that you used in your TDR overlay are, I don't know what the right word to use is, conservative or more conservative or less conservative than what other jurisdictions are using in their ratios when in the other local programs, which is basically implying you're being as generous, if not maybe a little more, than other cities who are seeing these programs be used in other private developments on the east side. Now, your market's a little bit behind, but at the same time, so I just sort of put that out there.
Okay.
So when we did the analysis here, we were using those types of ratios to sort of figure out how much you would take or what it's corresponding to. And as you've heard, I mean, one thing that's a little interesting about the chart from last week is that what we were showing, and again, this is why I'm saying these are rough numbers and ballpark and stuff, but one of the things that might be of note is that in all cases, the number of in lieu units we think could be less than the number of units preserved. So you're getting more preserved units through this effort than you would new affordable units. And as you've heard a lot, the people living in the preserved units are much lower income than we're probably going to see in the new units.
Yeah, so, I mean, preservation works in that sense. It's the best case scenario for the residents.
Right. But you may be getting just as many, if not more, because if those units go away, you've lost that many existing affordable units. You're getting it in this math, and it may be rough, and even if we're off by some magnitude, you know, for 50 to preserve 57, we think you need about 30, okay, in lieu amounts for units that would otherwise be at like 70% of median. and so on down the line when you look at the numbers here. And in some cases, the ratio is even less than 50%. Now, those numbers could be off, but even off by enough, it's still what we're saying is there seems to be a lot of room here to say preserving at what these are should net as much, if not maybe more, than what you would get as new, but the affordability levels might also feel very different for the people who are living there, the way they're structured.
All right, you're dying to move on.
I'm not dying to move on, but again, I think what
Would
we
you like
want
to move on?
I would like to
How do
move
we
on.
measure this? You don't have to be dying. Just
so
if you want to,
I think with,
we're ready to go.
I think what I heard with scenario 1 is that we want to add fee in lieu, the notion of fee in lieu, as an option for this scenario. Everyone comfortable with that?
Yes.
The other piece of that was that we think that the need to go to a regional option is not necessary, given the numbers we've looked at. So what we could say is we could start out in Canmore, and if it doesn't work, we could look at a regional approach. So I don't know if you're comfortable with that, but if so.
Any objection to that, Mike?
As long as we're not precluding a regional.
Can we include that that language in our proposal to the council?
Right.
That we recognize that may be necessary to go to a regional approach.
Okay, so moving on to scenario 2, and again, these are just scenarios that you can think about as we start moving forward. So in scenario 2, this was the one where new requirements for affordable housing would be placed on redevelopment. And then if you look down under number C, subset C there, it says for residents who do not want to move into the new units, provide a certain amount of relocation assistance funds to facilitate their relocation. We're recommending that you add a couple of other ideas here that we heard from public comment. So we'd like you to consider adding a longer notice of park closure or a requirement for a relocation plan. So that's different from relocation funding, which would remain in there as a possible direct assistance approach. But the plan is something that both the owners said they had worked with in other jurisdictions, and we heard that they felt that was a successful approach. So the idea is, do you want to add longer notice of park closure or a relocation plan requirement to scenario 2?
Any objections? Any questions on what it means?
What's the current, is it 1 year?
1 year, right.
Go ahead, Vice Chair.
So we're just saying longer, we're not trying to put a time on that?
No.
Okay.
What, in the cities where they have imposed relocation plan requirements or a longer notice period, what kind of time periods and what are what are some of the
so for
criteria of the
relocation
plan?
plans, if you just have a relocation plan, that in and of itself, the requirement typically has been before you give your 1 year notice, you have to have a relocation plan. So that sort of de facto makes a longer notice period.
Right.
And the relocation plan, I'm not sure how long they take, but I think 6 months. There's quite a bit of data collected,
Right.
at least from the plans I've heard about. And then longer notice, you remember that the state legislature had a bill that I think increased it from 12 to 18 months. I'd have to go back and look at that.
They had a bill or they passed a bill?
It was 18 months. It didn't pass.
Okay.
So, but anyway, that's kind of the notice period that at least the state was considering.
And what does the plan require when you say?
The plan requirements that I've seen, they require a lot of information. It was like how many units, I think the value, availability of other vacancies in other parks. Can you?
Included provisions to have a relocation assistant, consultant.
Right.
So it's
Talk to the residents?
Yeah.
So that
to
they
work with the residents.
knew what their options were and other
right.
resources might be available?
Right.
Okay.
So there's a variety of things that are sort of the builder works on to incorporate in that the city reviews. At least that's from talking to city staff, City of Seattle staff. So there isn't necessarily an explicit time period per se, but getting all that put in place has to be done.
Time consuming.
Right.
Right. It has to be done. Anything else? I mean,
Not
there
that
any
I-
other, like,
I just had one question.
well, yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
You had talked about the state bill not having passed, but it wasn't clear to me that it was voted on or whether it just didn't get brought up on the floor. I just want to make sure I'm clear on its status.
Do you know the exact status?
No, we could look it up, though, to see how far in the process it got and talk to the sponsor to see whether or not they're still where they see it at.
It might be useful just to know at least.
You're talking about for next legislative session? Because this one's over.
Right.
Right.
Well,
Right.
in other words, like, did it even get a committee hearing, or did it
Well,
get
yeah,
to one
right,
house
right.
and not the other house? And
Yeah,
Right.
those are good questions. I mean, how, like,
Hmm?
so it got out of committee? Stacy, it got out of committee?
so we'll try to get it clear, and then we might even try to talk to the sponsor to see where their energy is at this point. If they're like, we're going to do some follow-up. Often there's an agreement on what will be done during the break on certain bills.
Go ahead, Mike.
One observation and a comment. This is the only scenario, as I read it, that would actually allow the existing mobile home parks to be redeveloped as anything else. So it has a certain amount of importance, I think, to have in here and to make sure that it's a reasonable proposal. One of the things that I noted in here, and I'm not arguing against it, I like the idea of having an affordability level somehow pegged to the current cost to the existing mobile home residents, and in a number that would be sufficient to house them as an alternative. But is that a right that's personal to the existing residents, or is it something that's built into perpetuity? So that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, a generation from now, we're still at the same income level. The development is still restricted at the same income level. And is there any right to pass along that by the residents who would take advantage of that option for the property? Okay.
I think
Thank
he's asking whether the affordability requirement would be restricted to current residents if they chose to move in, or whether it would be, as in other places, a 50-year long-term affordability requirement.
I guess you could go either way. I think we've been presuming through the nature of the comments that you wanted housing longer term at the same relative affordability level.
Right, and so for the long term.
Yeah.
But that's something you might want to clarify.
What you said is true. What I'm asking, though, is the current affordability level of the mobile home park, I'm thinking, is less than what the standard rate is out there for affordable units built elsewhere. So do you want to leave it at that level 50 years out, or at some point does that come back up to the community standard?
So like 30 versus 50 over time.
Right. There's nothing I can think of to prevent either approach.
Well, I agree we could recommend it. I think I like our goal of trying to make it as low as possible, given the income constraints of the current residents.
Right.
That would be displaced, but have a chance of affording the new unit, the rent of the new unit. The risk is of having it permanently that low is that you won't get investors to take it up. Yeah, it means nothing.
Right.
If nobody invests.
Right. So the question.
So what you said, Mike, to have it, that initial rate accommodate the existing residents, but then go up to a higher level, whether it's affordable or market, would kind of be a good compromise. It would accommodate the existing residents, but it would give the developer more incentive to take up that kind of project.
Exactly.
And-
We want to protect the affordability for the
Right.
existing residents, but as the existing residents are no longer occupying
Right.
those units.
So I think
Do the
what
city
we
still
would,
wanna
what we
subsidize
might need to check is if it needs to be a time period, or it could be explicit residence, is whether or not explicit residence would be considered maybe a little bit, even if affordable, or lower income, whether or not there's a challenge to have it being linked to individuals versus like do it for 15 years kind of thing.
Right.
That's something we might want
Is
to
that,
check to
is that
see.
something for the city attorney to respond on?
Yes.
Right.
I think so.
I would also say, I certainly would hate to see those units go to market rate. The idea here is we're preserving affordable housing.
I'm not
I think-
against that. As I said, it would be some other level of
Oh,
affordability
I
or market rate.
misunderstood.
I'm sorry, that was my mistake.
I
I
see.
see this as a continuum,
Yes.
and there's compromise points we might be able to hit.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
No, we're getting new, this is new turf, I think. I don't think I've seen this done anywhere else, so it's going to be a lot of questions. Anybody on this side want to raise some questions? Some of my concerns about this scenario too, and this is the one that Councilmember Curtis thought was implausible just on its face, but you're saying there's sufficient capacity and this kind of thing, and the density. We've seen pictures of high-density projects in nearby communities that would have enough density to accommodate this scenario, right?
I actually have consistently said that I was concerned about this scenario, whether you could build at a density
Okay.
given constraints to accommodate the number of units that there are. So I think there's a level beyond which you are not unlikely to build. And I think one of the property owners raised this question, and you're in a market that's not really has not really been tried.
Right.
To try to do a really big project is perhaps unlikely, and for at least some of them, you would have to do a really big project to get the level of affordability.
And that's where I'm going. And that I do remember the comments. I think it was Daniel Stoner,
Yep,
who
it
owns one of
was.
the lots here near City Hall, and he's a developer, and he's very familiar with the economic
Exactly.
factors in this sort of development process. And he was saying there are a number of factors that don't work for this. Now, I don't think he's the only voice to listen to on this, but these are legitimate points. He said construction costs are through the roof. I think I'm quoting him there. He said the absorption rate is not high enough to expect it to pencil out in the near future. He also challenged whether financing was available for this kind of project, because Kenmore doesn't have a history of private sector multifamily housing. And that's yet another hole in our database, right? Is we should get answers, or the council should get answers to those big questions. And either the developer should, other than Mike Daniel Stoner, should be commenting on this, or even lenders should be commenting on this, right? Right.
Why zone it if there's really no feasibility?
So,
Well, what
if
it means is it doesn't change. It's a de facto overlay.
so this is where you have a little bit of dilemma, because you could sit people down right now, and they may say that, but like we heard from one owner, his intention is in the next building cycle.
Yeah.
He thinks it'll be there.
I don't remember
Kirkland,
that.
because of comments like that, did not include in their downtown when they rezoned it any affordability.
Wait, which owner said that he thinks that the demand will be there for this kind
Well,
of
he's
scenario?
saying he thinks the next building cycle is when he might start, right, when the one right
That
next
was
door to City
Daniel
Hall.
Stoner as well.
Right. So he made the comment that
Uh-huh.
he doesn't want to sell the property because he wants to develop it. It won't be this cycle, he
Right.
doesn't think, but maybe in the next cycle. So he sees future there.
Okay.
And the point I'm trying to make is that Kirkland, because I listened to builders in 1995, they put no affordability in their zoning when they upzoned, yet if by 2000 the economics clearly were to a point they could have asked for that and the deals would have still worked. That's always a dilemma that a community faces, is there's, and almost all the cities, I don't know if we've shown you the graphic, last year in the east side, 270 units. of affordable units were agreed to by builders through mandatory and voluntary programs on the east side in 1 year, which means they're building about 2,700 units, yet some of those rules have been on the books for 5 or more years, and when they were first written, people weren't jumping on them. So that's one of the dilemmas in asking the economic questions, and when, like one city, we've worked with cities who hire economists to help them with this. You know, the economist says if the rents change 3-4%, it completely changes their bottom line conclusions.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's part of the dilemma in these conversations, is respecting everything that's been brought up about the private sector, but understanding there's some fluidity over time.
I see this, and this is just my perception, and I let everybody speak for themselves. I see this as a more likely scenario for the parks that are downtown, not for the parks on the waterfront. I see the preservation as a more likely scenario for that. And I wonder if and I strongly suspect there are people on the council who have worked on the city's downtown plan and rezones from the early days of this city's incorporation, who will likewise feel like we have a problem with preserving places that we had a vision for 20 years ago being part of our higher density business core. So I think we need to say something to that end. I think they're going to be looking for something to that end. And I leave it to the rest of the commission to give me your thoughts on that.
I agree with you. You know, the parks south of here, beautiful park. I love to be there in the great residence.
Along the slough.
Yeah.
Yes.
But these up here are dilapidated. Their infrastructure is in bad shape. If you put some of these conditions on them, there is just going to be it's going to rot even more.
Mike?
I agree, particularly with the two properties we've talked about before. If we put too much conditions on the only scenario that would allow redevelopment, we're going to be painting ourselves into a corner. So in order not to lose the sense of what's in the existing scenario 2, maybe we have a scenario 2B that is very similar to the existing one, except we add some language to that along the lines, to the extent feasible, we could say financially feasible or market feasible, that we would require new development to the percentage of units as affordable to residents today. So you could have the option of we would still create a preference, a first right of refusal for the units that were built, but we're not constricting the amount of units to what's in the mobile home parks today.
So let me, and I think I saw some hands here, but let me pick up on that a little bit first. There's sort of a good news thing here as I look at this description of all the different parks. I see far fewer units in the downtown parks than there are on the waterfront. So go ahead. You look like you're dying to correct me.
No, I'm not at all. But what I'm really hoping we do before we get into this very specific discussion of the parks, the individual parks, is to go through all of the scenarios so that everybody's clear maybe what options are preferable to you, and then we'll turn our attention to what can we use to evaluate the parks, which I think is the document that you're looking at. I think, if we restrict ourselves to the first two, and there's another scenario that I really like. No. I'm hoping that we can do this a bit more
broad overview,
deliberatively, and go through scenarios, and then look at criteria, and then start thinking about where things match or don't match.
All right.
If you're okay with that.
Mike?
Yeah. Assuming that's what we're going to do, unless you were going to tell her that's not what we're going to do.
I wasn't. Of course I'm going to let everybody decide. I'm not going to unilaterally tell anybody.
So now that I know that, that's what we're going to do. I do have a point specifically to scenario 2. I think as we enumerate A, B, C as parts of this scenario, there's a missing one, which is maybe it's between B and C. For residents who are interested in taking advantage of one of these new affordable units in the new development, I think there needs to be provision for short-term relocation and potentially also some compensation for the lost equity of the home that's probably not movable. Those are two things that we've heard through public comment. If scenario 2 was to be considered, what do they do for the year that it takes to build a development? And I think that's something that would, and I'm not saying who has to bear that full burden, but I think it needs to be addressed. And then we've also heard about, for these units that are too old to be moved to different locations, they probably have no sellable value. Does that amount to a taking? Probably doesn't between private parties, but there is lost equity there, and maybe that should be addressed as well.
I think those are good points, because there's that time period, that relocation challenge while something's being redeveloped. I get that. And I think we had talked about relocation assistance or some other ways of trying to soften the blow. I'm kind of wrestling with the word equity, because from my economics background, equity is the difference between a market value and debt. And there's another word that doesn't get mentioned, but it's part of this, it's amortization. If you bought a trailer 30 years ago or even 20 years ago or something, and you've been living in it, and now it can't be moved, or it's totally defies code because it's obsolete in a lot of ways, or codes have changed, or it's just too fragile, or you can't sell it, there's really no equity there. You got value from living in it for decades or whatever chunk of time. I mean, I would think that's part of your cost of housing. That's the difference between the pad rent and the apartment rent, right? So I can't just assume there's equity in every trailer.
Perhaps
there was
not.
value. The people got value out of it, but
I
some
think
people say equity when they really mean. I think what they really mean is I put money into this, but what it really was cost of housing money, not investment money, because it doesn't have value now.
Well, it does have value now if sold for the purpose it's currently being used for, which is
if it can't
a manufactured
be sold.
home. Well, it only couldn't be sold. It can be sold.
If nobody's willing
it can't
to
be
buy
moved.
it.
Well, I think
In the
people would
park.
buy it if the park was going to remain in
Right.
operation as a park.
Correct.
But we know under
True.
the redevelopment scenario, it's not going to be sellable because nobody would buy something that's going to get torn down and flattened, right? But I think one way to look at the equity, and we can use your definition of equity as the difference between debt and value. Many of these have zero debt, and they have value today under the current operation of the park. Right? That's one way you could say, if this park was not to be redeveloped,
here's
what
how-
would this thing
okay.
be? And I get your amortization point's a good one, too.
But-
It's sort of the difference between looking at a piece of physical property versus a piece of real property.
But I think there's also another difference, and that is that manufactured homes are not viewed structurally the same as a home on a foundation. They're still a home for the people that live there, and they may have poured money and their decorating touches or whatever, but even homeowners that have a foundation and maybe spent more money to buy that home still have maintenance fees. All I'm really saying is that when you think about the investment that they made to buy a mobile home was not the same investment of buying something that potentially could appreciate in value.
Right.
So it's hard because
I'm just saying it's not simple.
it's not a
It's not
simple
simple math.
There's no like
hard to
equation
measure
you can
these things.
there's no equation you can come up with, but you can look at it this way. People made a choice to live there, and the value they got was to live there, and by living there, their overall housing costs were less. So whatever income they had, they spent it on X amount of dollars for their housing. But in my group, I heard people say, I chose to live there because then I would have disposable income to spend on other things. So, we asked that question earlier, what is affordable? It's hard because what's affordable to one person may not be
Well,
to another.
Arthur's been telling us,
Yeah.
and Arch and staff, what affordable is there is a fixed definition. It just depends on your income, and
Yes.
it's 30% of your
Yeah.
income.
Right.
Go ahead.
So I just wanted, I think I wanted to support Mike's point, which is I'm not sure about the equity in the home in a traditional sense, but certainly the homes are valuable because they are sold. I mean, there are vacancies and they are sold to other people, and if the park were not going to be redeveloped, they could sell their home. And I'm also not certain that those homes don't appreciate, particularly the ones down along the river. I think
I'm not
there
saying
is
that
appreciation
they're
in
all-
terms
I
of
don't-
the
I'm not saying they all
sale.
fit into one box. I'm not saying
Right.
they're all fully amortized, and I'm not saying
Right.
they don't appreciate. Just saying they're very different. Each home has a different
Yeah.
history and a different value, and some, if there's no buyer, technically there's no equity. If they can't be moved, then they have less value.
If no one will buy them.
Or if it's rezoned so that the park's going to close or going to be redeveloped.
Right.
Anyway,
So-
it's messy, and maybe this goes into, we give the council a very general description with this is one of our many caveats
Right.
with this section, but go ahead.
I like adding
Yeah, it's almost two
an
separate
additional.
things. There's the
it-
short-term
yeah.
relocation component, which I think is a
Right.
miss.
Yes.
Perhaps we could add that.
Yeah.
Right.
The equity one, I understand it's more complicated.
Mhm.
It could maybe, for the purposes of moving this scenario forward, be considered a miscellaneous I don't mean to call the value anyone has in their home a miscellaneous expense, but for the purposes of this scenario, it could be part of the bucket of relocation expenses that we will have to address.
Yeah.
Did you want, go ahead.
On the equity question, is there any protection under current law when a park is redeveloped that would recognize the value of the residents' value or equity in their homes?
I don't think
You're
so.
going to redevelop a
No.
park. Is the owner required to recognize any value that's?
No, but residents have opportunity to resources to the extent they're available in that state fund to help address part of what Mike is describing. And I think it was, and we'd have to double check this. I'm going from memory of conversations with Ishbel about that might have been changed, that how you can use that money is more flexible than it was in the past. So that, I think, is to some degree a little bit what you've been talking about the last few minutes. But we can try to double-check that legislation to clarify what are residents allowed to try to receive. It's not necessarily directly from the owners of the park, but it is something the state has recognized as an impact that they're trying to help address.
So is the assumption there that if a park was to close and be redeveloped, that the owners could move their mobile homes out, and therefore there was no loss in equity? Is that, I'm just trying to.
I think it started with the idea of trying to help with moving, and then there were so many difficulties of doing that, and this is now where I'm getting in very, very great territory, and I'd want to double-check notes and stuff. But my understanding is they tried to flex it open because it was so hard for people to use the resources the way they were being made available. But the impact was there. So.
This is kind of in that vein of thought, but if you looked at a different development, say an older apartment complex that a developer wanted to purchase, and there was affordable housing in that apartment complex, or it was affordable, in quotation marks, and the developer was wanting to redevelop it for market value, what are the scenarios for the displaced people in an affordable housing situation like that? Nothing?
Nothing.
Depends on the city. Seattle has some provisions.
So we have an opportunity here to preserve affordable housing, and if something does get developed, put some things in place that help people in that transition.
Yes, you can do programs where the source for those resources will come from.
True.
Will be primarily, the state law will say how much you could ask the owners to do, which is very limited, very limited. But you can use local resources to help the poor and infirm, which is defined at a certain income level. but then that would be city resources. So whether or not you chose to use in lieu fees to help with some of, if you some or, that you're, but that's more of a council conversation because most of that's going to fall.
Yeah.
And I think what our job is to make sure it's clear who you can turn to if you start layering that stuff on.
Yeah.
So what I heard for scenario 2 was the notion of going ahead to add in longer notice of park closure or relocation plan as options that could be considered, and also compensation of some sort for those who do want to move into the new development for kind of that interim period, a short term. Did I catch that?
Go ahead.
I just wonder, is it either or, a park closure or a relocation plan, or is it both?
I think they're presented as options. The way
Okay, I just wouldn't want to make it seem like it's one or the other. Just the wording, it says or, park closure or a longer notice of park closure or a relocation plan requirement.
Both things would happen if it was
I can phrase it either way. I was thinking of it in terms of examples. For residents who do not want to move into the new units, provide a certain amount of relocation assistance funds, or a longer notice of park closure, or a relocation plan. If you all feel comfortable with all three of those, I'll put them in as statements rather than options.
I do, as options to be.
Yeah, just options.
Yeah.
Just
further
options?
Considered.
Okay.
Not or. Like
Well,
this
could we say
or.
one or more of the following options and go
Yeah, something to that.
A, B,
Yeah.
C?
That's good.
So scenario 2, can we move to scenario 3?
You good? Yeah. All right.
Okay. So scenario 3 was the notion of resident purchase, but we've heard we've talked to folks and then have heard from others that resident purchase may prove difficult. So not saying that wasn't an option, but it might be appropriate to amend the scenario to add nonprofit, agency. There could be a wealth of resources brought to bear on purchase. It doesn't have to be the residents who are purchasing. It could be somebody else who's purchasing, the King County Housing Authority, a nonprofit, mobile home community preservationist. So it was just broadening that scenario, which is really focused on resident purchase.
The goal would be so the residents
Right.
and the housing would be preserved.
Correct.
Mike, this is probably more semantics than anything else, but could we phrase this in terms of being a blending of potential resources, which could include all of the above?
Yep.
Or any or all of the above?
Anybody else?
Yeah, I don't understand may I go?
Please.
I don't understand what the action verb here is. So, scenario 1, we talk about controlling redevelopment. For number 2, we have rezoning. This one seems more ideological.
It's vague, and I think the verb you're looking for is assist.
I think this is really the direct assistance option, or a more targeted direct assistance option.
Perhaps that should move up maybe to the first sentence of, provide direct assistance to, just to be very clear what this scenario is about.
And I would assume it'd take a lot of money to pull that off. Government money or nonprofit money.
Or the in lieu money.
Huh?
Or the in lieu money.
Oh, yeah.
That's
Mike?
right.
Vanderline?
That's what I'm
I
saying.
agree with the sentiment that I've heard. What I would suggest is the first couple of sentences that begin with the commission and then end about halfway down are more narrative and are more along the principle sorts of things we've discussed for other scenarios. I'd suggest starting this section with the verbiage that says this, and I would first of all take out the commission is interested in exploring ways. This is not within our charge. Let's take that out of there. We're not making proposals or recommendations. And then take the rest of that sentence. The city of Kenmore could assist residents seeking blah, 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 and make that the first sentence.
Right, with, I think, the expansion we talked about,
With
City of Kenmore,
nonprofits and in lieu. too.
blending of resources, any and all of the above. I liked that approach to purchase, basically. Okay?
We have agreement?
So, given that this is almost a flavor, I assume there would be some rezoning in association with 3 to preserve in the event of a purchase by a nonprofit, for example. So, just in terms of order, 3 being a slight variation on scenario 1, would it make sense to reorder these? And it's almost like we're talking about a preservation scenario, redevelopment scenario, and a preservation scenario.
Mhm.
Would it make sense to have our 2 preservation scenarios together chronologically or visually?
This is only a preservation scenario if it's exercised. You're talking about zoning to, you're talking about making this part of scenario 1?
Having this question too. Are we making these recommendations where the council could look at these scenarios and perhaps adopt all 3 of them in some fashion as we get to the specifics and kind of flesh out options with a little more detail? It's not like one or the other, correct?
I think it's probably
going to be a combination.
there could be some
of
some overlap or some pieces of the different scenarios that could go with other scenarios.
Yeah.
I think there would need to be some regulatory component to 3, or else, and we learned from our city attorney last week that we couldn't create a statutory right of first purchase by the owners without
By the residents.
a condemnation effect, right?
By taking?
I thought he actually had related it to a condemnation of the land if you did that, but I think those were his words. But
So could I jump in?
Sure.
If you use city resources, you will put covenants on the property. Now, you may want to do the rezone anyway, but the covenants that have come with the funding that have been done by cities and other public agencies are typically 50 years minimum. So you are essentially, with the funding covenants, putting that into play. But whether or not you still want to do design, the group may have not an issue because their intent is what you're helping to fund, so they may go along for that part of it as well. So I think it's not a critical component, but there is a logical reason to bring it up.
Don't the residents get to decide if they buy it?
Not if you're giving them money or loaning them money or whatever. I mean, that's part of what's the public willing to do in order to help this player. Now, if they're using all their own money, then that's maybe a different story. But if you're intended, so I think the zoning is a good question to bring up, but there may be other vehicles that are publicly created that are also creating that long-term preservation as well. So it may not be an absolutely critical component.
Can I?
Go ahead.
I want to go out of order on something, on this potential new scenarios. I am intrigued greatly about the second bullet point down, and it came up in our groups, is to, and I've talked about it before, identify some single-family areas. You buy it at a single-family price, you upzone it, you put in pads, and you move the people that we want to take care of, and we want to continue to have mobile home parks because it's a neat community. And then the city or whoever or developer comes in, and the city, it's not going to cost the city that much money because you're upzoning it after you buy it. Condemnation, okay, possibly. And then you upzone it. I think that's a great idea. Then the people who lose their homes have an opportunity to go to the new park. And given the infrastructure of a lot of these parks, they're just not going to be viable. If you really want to do it right, I think that's what you should do. At least explore it. I think it's. I mean, you'd have to have the land to do it with, and I don't know if you can go to a residential piece of property and identify it and buy it for that price and then upzone it. And I don't know. I just think that's a really cool idea.
So I think having that idea on the table, but what I would put out there is the economics of real estate right now. If you go back to the preservation chart, you'll notice that we assumed land values for townhomes was like 100,000, and land values for flats, stacked units, is more like 30 to 40,000. Value of single-family land in this region now, like the lot behind my house sold for $450,000 2 years ago. That up, in fact, we are hearing in some cities people are taking multifamily land and building single-family homes on it or at townhouse densities or because the value of land for single-family as we have less and less single-family. So, but I'm not trying to take away your idea of could we locate something somewhere. I'm not sure your upzone is going to be some magical part of that equation. That's the only point I'm trying to make to that.
Interesting.
But it still is a notion that is out there for you to consider and could potentially work somewhere.
I was thinking we need to wrap up scenario 3 before we. I mean, I appreciate your enthusiasm, and we'll get to it.
Okay.
We even get to it first, right after. But I did want to tie a bow on scenario 3.
I said I was out of order, so.
No, that's all right. So where are we on scenario 3? There was the 50. Arthur, you were talking about a 50-year deed restriction or a covenant that would be imposed if this were exercised, right?
If there was public money
with
involved.
Public resources, right, with the direct assistance piece.
And I have mixed feelings about that because things change a lot in 50 years. And it might be that's a critical area for some other use, and then we're stuck. The city is stuck.
Well, it's the city's agreement. The city's in control.
Right? But what are we recommending?
No, what I'm saying is if it's a covenant with the city can amend the covenant, can they're the signature party, but they want to make sure that they get appropriate compensation or public benefit in exchange for changing the public benefit they're currently.
Well, I guess it depends on the language of the restriction, doesn't it? I think it would depend on the language of the covenant, whether the city can unilaterally decide to change the use.
It depends on who the signatories are. But if it's a city resources, you have the right to go back to council and change what you do. So, but I mean,
I'm a little confused because when, for example, I deal in real estate law as part of my job, my day job.
Right.
And so when two people agree to an easement, for example, you can't unilaterally change it. You would have to get the other party to the easement.
That's my point, right?
So the city couldn't unilaterally change the terms of the
No,
covenant unless its language gave it that authority.
But once you have an ownership entity whose interest is to keep it, yeah, you're right. The other party would want to have to change too.
Right.
But that was sort of the presumption that in the future, if the other party wanted to change, then the city would have the option to go back and think about the change.
Right.
But the city would be locking itself into a really long-term arrangement that it may want to change, and the owners may not.
I don't know how different that is from zoning, but
zoning can be unilaterally changed.
Okay. All right.
By the city. Maybe I'm confused. I don't know. It's just when
I guess I'm generally not. I don't usually hear the thing that's we're going too long. It's not long enough, because if we're going to make the investment, try to keep what you're investing in as long as you can. So it's not a typical question posed, but it might be.
Yeah, I think, Doug, to your point, maybe the notion is that if the purchase occurs and there's city money involved, that a corollary rezone that would allow only mobile home parks would go into place. I think that would get to your concern, because then the city would, as you said, have the unilateral ability
I'd prefer that
to change
a deed
the zoning.
Right. Yeah. And what I'm saying is the public fund sources, including the city, your city, have done that. So
go ahead, Mike.
I'm just a little unclear myself on what we're really trying to accomplish here. If we're talking about city and/or public money of some sort that's actually financing this, how does it actually become the property of
The
current
residents?
If they have no financial interest in this, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
So getting back to your question then, this is now it's either city or some public authority that has the ownership of this. It's put investment into it for a purpose.
Well, it would be able to loan any party, the city, its resources, any party, so long as they agree to the covenant. So now we're getting into the weeds. That's what I'm sort of saying.
Well, my primary point here is I want to be clear that the mobile park residents understand that they're not going to become that through this are not going to become owners.
Make that statement.
Pardon me?
I'm not sure that's accurate.
How would they become owners?
You buy property all the time, you have loans, and you don't always, but you still.
Yeah, it just seems to me like we're talking about two separate scenarios here. One in which the city or public dollars buy the property and preserve the property as it is right now with the folks that are there.
So we know of instances where public resources have gone. But it's the same as we make loans to home buyers. We give them down payment assistance loans. Down payment assistance. So that's a similar scenario where public resources are used and debt on the property.
And that's more what I thought this was about.
Yeah, okay.
Was helping
And I
the
can see-
residents borrow the money they need to buy the park.
With some sort of public assistance.
Yeah.
So,
and
but they're putting equity, they're putting dollars
They
into
would
this
put their own money
over a
in.
period of time, so
Right.
ownership transfers to
Right.
them.
Or they would repay all the money over time.
To illustrate, you get down payment, you get some kind of loan as an individual homeowner, you're going to pay 6%, 5%. Down payment assistance programs that we are doing right now, publicly funded, what we do is we say we loan you a certain amount of money, you make no payments until X year, and we're going to only charge you 1% because you're qualified to receive your lower income so you can get better terms.
Okay. I see
And
that.
I'm not saying
I
that's
can
how it
see
would be
that.
done here. I'm just giving you an example, though, of where working directly with a group that's the buyer rather than through a nonprofit.
So do you all view a difference between, in your view of the scenarios, between a version where the residents own the property and it's preserved, or an agency or a nonprofit owns the property and it's preserved? I was kind of grouping both of those together under scenario 3 as basically as
That's the way
purchase.
I read it, and hence my confusion.
Yeah.
My question.
And I think
Oh.
you can.
Pardon me?
I think you can sort of group them together, especially at the level you're going right now.
Yeah, because we're not really coming up with the details of the negotiation or what, all we're trying to do is come up with a scenario and then come up with recommendations that fit that scenario for the city council to consider.
Right.
Just as long as we're on it, I think we should probably call these proposals instead of scenarios, because a scenario is so broad, it's just a statement, a description. But
How
these were
about options instead of, because we
Yeah.
propose, we're putting some.
I'd rather call it options than scenarios, yeah. Anyway, scenarios is a little bit, I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with that, because we're doing more than just
'Cause it's a
describing something.
Because it's a scene and there could be drama.
No, but. So are we pretty much on the same page with 3? Lori, do you think we're somewhere where we could talk about this is what we're thinking here?
I think, yes, rewording of 3 to acknowledge it relates to purchase of the property by residents or nonprofit or agency or some combination of that in exchange for long-term preservation, however that happens, through zoning, covenants, whatever.
I think I raised this question before. I still wonder with 3 if it can really work without an overlay as well. One
Right, that
reason-
was the zoning piece.
It's like a contingent overlay.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I'm stuck on that mentally is that I have a hard time imagining where an agency or a homeowners association could make a competitive offer on these lands, competing with developers who would be seeking high density or multifamily housing on it.
So what you're suggesting is a rezone to a mobile home park zone to facilitate, perhaps, eventual purchase.
And that's why I was thinking of it as a flavor of scenario one, because that is the rezone
Right.
scenario.
Correct.
If I could be wrong about that. I mean, I don't know the market well enough, but realistically, if an agency or a homeowners association could make a competitive bid, or an incredibly generous mobile home park owner accepted the homeowner's bid regardless of what market rate was for the land, then it could work. Yeah, perhaps it could.
So Lori has said, let's not get into
Yeah, I know.
which scenario is suited for which park, but I see this as suited for the preservation, the parks on the slough, more than the parks that the city has already zoned for other uses years ago. So in that sense, I agree with you. I think it's suited, but I didn't want to jump the gun on what suits what first, but that's kind of how I see it.
And that's the natural.
Yeah.
I think at some point in our coming meetings, we'll start to flesh out those caveats that we all decided earlier were so important to include with the scenarios, and I think that could be one.
Okay.
I'll just stay mentally stuck there for the next several weeks, and I'll remind everyone.
Speaking
Good.
of next meetings, it's 9:08. Where's a good stopping point tonight? Is we're kind of
If we could look at the other scenarios and see if any of these you want to add in. I think
Okay,
when
try that.
staff was looking at these, I think we were looking at probably the first one as sort of being the most viable to include to supplement the three you've already looked at.
Right.
the first of the new scenarios.
Correct.
On the back of the page. Okay.
Yes.
So I can quickly give you a description. Again, these came from either public comment or the research that we've done. So the first scenario is to incentivize park preservation through things like loans for infrastructure upgrades, reduced utility bills, tax incentives, or, and this might be another approach, increasing allowable density or decreasing affordable housing requirements over time in exchange for some period of preservation. So this would be the notion that today you are zoned for X, and we'll just use an example of 10 years. In 10 years, you can be zoned for Y, which is perhaps really quite a bit higher density, if you preserve for 10 years, and you put a covenant in place that says you'll preserve for 10 years. It's a way to get a longer notice period. Alternatively, you could go to direct assistance and say, we will give you a loan to upgrade your infrastructure.
The owner alone.
Right.
Right.
In exchange for some period of preservation. Now, that would be a huge cost potentially, so the period of preservation might be pretty significant. But it's kind of an interim way to focus on preservation for a lesser time period.
So you're preserving for a period of time, but it's also giving the residents time.
Right.
It kind of diminishes the value of their unit the closer you get to that deadline.
The
to
versions that I've
sell
seen
it.
was if you take advantage of this, then you are making a commitment.
Correct.
For that period of time to maintain the park
But you're also, maybe year 8, somebody decides they want to sell their home.
Mm-hmm.
You're also you'd have to take that into
Right.
consideration
Right.
too, so that someone buying it would only be getting 2 years.
Right, correct. That's true.
Anybody else?
I think I like this one because what we know is the infrastructure is not good.
I will say we went out on a tour with initially with King County Housing Authority, but then also with a group that a nonprofit group that works to preserve mobile homes, and we said, now what about Infrastructure. Can you improve infrastructure? We've heard you can't improve the infrastructure. And this is one person's perspective, but they own multiple mobile home parks, and they said they have never had trouble phasing. Some layouts make it easier to do the phasing, but that they have not had trouble phasing, for example, if the infrastructure is in the road, to replace that. So I think that particular person, again, subjective opinion, was feeling like the present condition of the park need not be the future condition of the park, that there was, in fact, the opportunity to upgrade, that was not something that couldn't be done, which was kind of the impression I think we were left with.
Anybody else?
But they would need some incentive to do that, some loans or some assistance, or?
Well, we would offer the incentive in exchange. Well, there are two approaches. You could offer the incentive. Linwood offered incentives, and nobody took them up on it. But you could offer incentives and say, if you want to take advantage of these programs, we will do that for you, but you have to preserve for a certain period of time. The notion of a phased zoning is different. It says, for now, mobile home park, but in X number of years, we would like, we understand that things may change, and so we're going to give you a present at the end of this period of time, and that present could be increased density, it could be you don't have to do affordable housing, or it could be something desirable in terms of zoning that would make keeping it for some period of time a desirable option.
And then you have this last sentence, obtaining a right of first refusal to buy the park.
Right.
Who would have the right of first refusal?
The city. For example, if the city loaned, or whoever loaned, this is more to do with the loaning issue. If the city loaned money, or someone loaned money for infrastructure improvements, for example, then they would at the same time could take the right of first refusal as a part of that deal.
It's so quiet up here.
It's very quiet.
Well, I mean, this has merit. I feel like I haven't had time to digest it. So I feel like, gee, maybe I'd like to think more about it before we vote on it, I guess is how I feel. But if others, I mean, I like a lot of the qualities about this, but
it's like a midterm preservation option. It's not the permanent preservation option. It's
right.
A preservation for a shorter period of time.
Mike.
I agree. I think there's some merit in this. When I read it, but more when I listen to you, Lori, I can parse out a number of different thoughts that probably need to be broken out into separate bullet points. My general concern, I have no objection to putting something this reworded on a list, but I really worry about the viability of it. That would be my caveat on this. To the extent that you have a midterm incentive, I worry about what's the real incentive to the park owner to maintain or invest in the infrastructure over a period of time, knowing that they're not going to have any value in that infrastructure whatever period of time you go out there. I think there's an incentive to not invest, to preserve those funds and wait it out until I can redevelop, perhaps advantageously.
But here's a twist on this that I think, and this relates to what I think the owners were saying about ways that we would induce us to preserve this use, and that was, instead of relating it to improving the infrastructure, just give them strong financial incentives to preserve the use. The tax breaks they were talking about, property tax reductions, there might be some others. Utility, I think, came up, utility costs. And if they got that benefit, they had more reason to keep that use. And that's something I think it's got a better chance of happening than asking them to invest for a much longer period in a new infrastructure.
And I can see that. I just am concerned about, is there really an incentive here for them to maintain maintain that infrastructure when they could keep that funding for themselves if not expended. I could understand how they would be interested in receiving more money.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, what are they going to do with that more money? Will that be reinvested?
Exchange for, they would get the benefit in exchange for agreeing to preserve it for a period of time.
Bottom line, I think what you do, we'd end up with the city becoming an oversight to this to make sure that the parks were maintained in that period of time.
Isn't that already true?
Yeah, but obviously it hasn't worked too well.
Well, I mean, the parks function. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how bad they are and
Well, that's,
that kind of
you
thing.
know, again, we're getting into the weeds, but that would
Yeah,
be
you're
my
right.
concern.
Yeah,
I just don't understand the
It
incentive.
says loans for infrastructure.
Yeah, I know, and I'm saying, and I think, go ahead.
And so that assumes that the money's going for that purpose, not just in his pocket.
Right. I think Mike's point was it's unlikely to happen because if they have plans to sell or redevelop or something, why would they undertake the repayment obligation?
This was just in there as an example.
Yeah.
It's not saying this is the only way for infrastructure. This is just saying as an example, and that was one of the examples, and there's a whole bunch of other ones there. So I think that really this is basically saying that direct assistance might be a way to get sort of the park preserved for an interim period in whatever form that direct assistance takes.
Yeah, I agree with that. And
Yeah.
Lori, you
And
wanted to
I was
add?
just going to say, and we have heard from property owners who don't intend to convert their use, who mentioned low or no cost
Yeah, it
loans.
may work for somebody, yeah.
It could work
Right.
for some. Others it wouldn't work for, but
Right.
We heard from another park owner who said, if you make a sweet zoning incentive, that might entice me to preserve it for some period of time. and to
Right, so
commit
you're
to
talking
that.
about increasing the development capacity from what it is now. It would
In the
just kick in
future.
at a certain date down the
Correct.
road.
Correct.
Right, or you might say, in the future, where you have to do, for every 3, 1 affordable, we'll let you do 5 for every 1 affordable because you preserved it
Yeah,
for
yeah.
15 years,
Right.
something like that.
Anybody on this side? Okay. These are good ideas. That's all I can say right now. I don't know how concrete we can be about it.
I'm in the same place with you. I'd like to see those maybe developed out with a little more specifics
Mhm.
to understand.
Am I hearing that from?
Any objections to this? Okay.
Okay.
I think it'd be helpful to add that scenario or proposition.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next one is actually
The
the
McDonald
one
proposal?
right.
There you go.
Jumped ahead, though.
He's okay. I'm okay with jumping in. He was willing to let us go back. Anybody else want to comment on this?
Vice Chair? Well, I just wonder, who's gonna be the developer? I mean, we heard there's no new mobile homes built in the last 10 years. Is this going to be fundamentally up to some kind of nonprofit or the city, or how is this going to happen?
Well, I do know that my ex-law partner in the last 10 years built a new park up in Skagit County. And he loves the business. He wants to build more of them if he can. So I believe that there are people that will, given the right economics, would love to make a new park.
Given the right economics.
Yeah, that's the key.
Skagit's got economics
Skagit
that
and-
we don't
and
have.
Kenmore, yeah, so-
That's the thing.
Sure, but if you get a lot more density with a mobile home park than single family.
Oh, yeah.
And we talked about having, the little shacks that they're doing, that they got, 350 square feet where they're putting people in.
Cottages, yeah.
Cottages and all
Yeah.
that stuff, and so this is and the residents of these mobile home parks that we've heard from, they love the community that they have, and
Right.
and if a mobile home developer can make money on it, I think it's doable.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. It sounds really good in theory. I guess I'm a little skeptical of the viability of it. Based again on the economics of it, unless it is again some kind of city or public agency.
You might get some pushback from single-family zoned areas on this.
That's true.
Realistically,
That's true. And, I got an article from the Seattle Times business section, and it's about Southern California. Push for denser housing splits environmentalists in California. And
yes, it does.
yes. So,
and you can find those articles in the New York Times also.
yeah, I mean, it's the, okay, not in my backyard, but,
Yeah.
but if we want to preserve this type of housing, then it's got to go somewhere.
Well, but you're not talking about preserving. You're talking about expanding, I think.
Well, expanding it is preserving it in a sense, because you're going to lose it up here, let's say.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. You're speaking.
I think I've said what.
So Scott, just so I'm clear, you're thinking of it more as a way to create housing so that a current mobile home park could transfer there, and then the land that park sits on could be developed into bigger and better things.
Yes.
Okay.
That's my thought. And a developer, if it's streamlined enough, if they can, we'll rush it right through, you'd probably get people standing in line to do that.
Mikey, I think you.
I'd be okay adding this to the list with a couple of changes. One would be, I don't know why we would limit it to mobile home parks. We've already talked about, small cottages, tiny homes, things like that might be more attractive and more likely to be developed. So if what we're looking is an alternative low-income housing, affordable housing, realizing that mobile home parks are going to go away, that would be a way to do it. The other way would be the other concern is I'd want to make sure that the way we approach this, I could word this as the city would identify an offer to rezone properties in this way, but I want to be sure that we didn't just go out and say, okay, here's 30 acres, we're going to rezone it, see what happens. I'd like to do this more as almost an RFP sort of process to figure out if there's interest before we actually rezone the property.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I just want to endorse Mike's, especially Mike's first point about looking beyond mobile home to other types of affordable housing in that scenario or in that area. So
I want to add in that this is like a variety of a no preservation option. If we're thinking about preserving existing affordable housing, in some ways this is a corollary to the notion of redeveloping into multifamily and requiring an affordability component. This is developing a new affordable housing development. So I just want to make that clear and be sure that you're comfortable with that as an alternative of the no preservation requirement. It kind of goes hand in hand with it. Scenario 2, it's similar to scenario 2.
Boy, I think everything, it would almost have to be, the stars would have to align so unlikely. It'd have to align just so for this park to open up when that park closed. So that everybody can move into the new park. And that even assumes that somebody thinks this is a good area for yet another mobile home park, which hasn't happened in this area for over and I mean the Puget Sound area. And I don't know why Skagit would be outside of that, but we're just getting, that is so contrary to the information we're getting from staff and the economic trends. I think it's almost like promising something we can't deliver on. I feel a little guilty proposing something like this when it's so unlikely.
Well, my ex-law partner, he says, Scott, I love mobile home parks because people sell their houses more often than a manufactured home leaves its pad.
Yeah.
They just don't leave, so it's going to be there, and it's going to make the owner of the park money continuously.
Yeah. and so
It is a viable business, and I think even some of the,
I'm not saying no to this. I'm just saying
Yeah.
I'm highly skeptical, and I feel a little guilty that
Can I ask a question about this?
we're using it as sort of a relocation proposition.
well, yeah, that's the other, it's kind of dual purpose.
If it worked, but
Yeah.
anyway, go ahead, Mike.
Is there a presumption here, Lori, that the manufactured homes in Park A could be transported to the new park?
There's not a presumption. It's possible. We've heard that if some are newer, it may be doable, but there was no presumption there. I think that staff has concerns about this approach, and I think primarily because of some of the questions that were raised about rezoning certain parts of the city for this use specifically without knowing whether, in fact, this use is viable. Anyway, so this was one that we had heard, but I'm not sure that we would suggest moving forward with it.
So one consideration is one of the charts shows you what percentage of the units are older than 76, and if it's older than 76, those can't be moved. So some might be able to be moved, but some would not be able to be moved, depending on, and the percentages depends on the park.
Arthur, is that a State Department of Transportation regulation? What controls that? Is it a safety concern, a health concern?
I don't know exactly what there's different requirements for how those units were built before 76 versus post 76, so they're built differently. I don't know what all the logic was to say you can't move pre-76.
And I'm not sure actually that post 76 can always be moved. It really depends on the individual home, I think.
It's 9:27. What time did they lock the doors around here?
The doors were locked at 8:30.
No, but isn't there some expectation? I thought there was some reason.
To be here all night. No, you can go out.
Can we order food? Yeah, I'm thinking about. No, I'm thinking that I thought there was a reason why 9:30 was sort of typically our witching hour, but
No,
I don't think
there's
there's
no
a door.
magical reason for it.
Okay.
It just seems to be that after 2.5 hours, you seem
We've
to
had-
lose energy at
well,
some
and
point.
so that's why I think we ought to set this aside. You know, there's obviously a lot of questions about this one, and maybe we've got in the next 3 minutes time to say something, or you could say something about the last two, and then we could call it a night.
Well, what I could do, so we'll stop and take up rezoning other property next time. That's where
Okay.
we'll start. So the last two, these were proposed, I think, by property owners, so that these are sort of alternatives or different versions of the no preservation scenario, whereby in this case you would mitigate for loss of a mobile home park by requiring developers to purchase other existing affordable housing, like other pre-existing affordable apartments. We had a list, I think, early on of different affordable locations, and then as units in the purchased properties turned over, the residents could move in, or a notion of cascading redevelopment, so one park redevelops and then folks from another park could move in. So these are all ways to mitigate, but they all fall under that vein of no preservation, just different ways to treat the loss of the park. Then the last bullet point is we had heard from some folks that it's back to the mobile home park overlay idea, and they were specifically referencing the senior mobile home park overlay. I'll have a call in to the city attorney about that, but again, the overlay would allow a very limited number of uses, and in the proposal that we heard, that didn't even include TDR. It was for those senior parks down by the river that are already close to their maximum density. So.
I thought we thought we talked about that early in this process. And had,
You did. You
the
talked about
balancing is-
generally an overlay.
Right.
This, again, was just the notion because of the circumstance, because of age, and I'm not sure you can do that, but that was an idea that was brought back. So I thought because it came back through the public comment, we should
Okay.
at least revisit it.
So I think that's where we leave it until next time, and we start
That'd
with...
be fine.
Okay. So that concludes our further discussion tonight of mobile home parks. Is there any new business? Are there any announcements? You guys are good? Then I adjourn this meeting.